What is up guys, Alex from Lakey Wargames here and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the brand new Ossiarch Bonereapers 3rd edition Battletome, and we're going to be looking over it and giving our first thoughts and opinions on it. Okay, so before we get too far into the video, I just want to say that this is not going to be a complete book walkthrough. We're not going to go through every war scroll or command trait sort of word for word and analyze them that way. This is going to be more of a brief overview of the book and my initial thoughts and feedback, just in more of a general scope than a really in-depth look into the whole thing. For that I would recommend Warhammer Weekly. They did a fantastic show where they walk through the whole book. They go everything one by one, break them down and give their first reactions that way. So I will include a link to their show in the comments below, and I'd recommend to go and check that out if seeing the full book would be more your sort of thing. If you haven't seen it yet, if you don't own the tome, something like that is brilliant because it really shows off everything. You get to read all the scrolls and see it all as you go through. Whereas this video here is going to be for those of you who have already read the tome, own the tome, or you've already watched the show like that, so you have a brief knowledge of sort of how this new book shakes out. And mine's going to be a lot more sort of on the surface level. We're going to look over some positives, some negatives, the combinations, just first looks, how this book's going to shape up and shape out, and yeah, so just wanted to get that out of the way before we get too deep in. Okay, so we're going to break this down into sort of three main parts. First, we're going to be looking at my thoughts of the faction and the new tome as a whole. Then we're going to point out some of the positive changes that I think coming from this book from the old book, and then we're going to point out some of the more negative changes coming across to this new tome, things I don't think work so well or we found a little underwhelming. And then we're going to close this one out with what I overall think at the end of the day, how competitive this army is going to be based on the first impressions that we're going to talk about through this video. So let's get it started and let's jump on into the bullet points of the first impressions I've had from this tome. Okay, so the first thing I thought when I was reading through this book is that if you are familiar with the old Battletome, whether you played Ossiarch Bonereapers or you played against them a lot, or you're just someone who generally, you know, has broad knowledge of all the tomes, maybe you like going to lots of tournaments, that kind of thing, so you have to have some knowledge of all the factions. If you are familiar in any way, shape or form with the old book, this book will feel very familiar to you. There are a few key units that have had changes to the wording of their abilities, or their abilities have slightly shifted. For example, like Shield Wall on the Mortek Guard works slightly differently. The Soul Mason's War Scroll spell has slightly changed. Little things like that. But at the end of the day, this book is very much in touch with how it used to work in the old one. So that character that supports foot troops, you know, although his spell and that might have changed a little bit, he still supports foot troops. Example, just like that. So that's what we're going to start off with. If you're familiar with the old book, this one will feel very similar, and that can be great for someone who's returned to a new book. Sometimes it can be a very bad thing if a book is completely flipped on its head, because of those who fell in love with the book the way it was, you know, might not like the new one. I know some people might not like an old book, and then when it completely changes, it can be good for those people bringing them across and new people liking the faction. But for me, the old OBR book felt very much like OBR should feel, and this new book brings that across very well and continues in on that theme. Which brings me to my second point. I absolutely love the theme in this book. I love that it plays, or it wants to play on the table, how this army feels in the lore, and that is with a strong command structure where the army adapts mid-battle to the strategy of their opponents. You know, if someone's coming round on the flank to try and, you know, charge into your troops, the troops will then get a command from their commanders and, you know, reform and brace for impact sort of thing, and that's exactly how this book feels on the table with its command point structure. It's all based around, you know, having your units on the table. You get lots of CPs. The new OBR book has a massive table of its own command structure. Coming into the new book, we now have access to the RDP, or Relentless Discipline points. Was basically like a version of command points for Ossiarch before 3.0 introduced them as sort of a general thing, and that was OBR's thing. Now that's gone away. It's just been replaced by having a lot of just normal command points, but then you get a lot of command abilities that are now just on the faction itself. And these will allow you to be able to do things with your army, sort of adapting on the fly, being able to make guys move quicker, being able to make them fight better, whether you can buff their save, buff their attacks. There's all sorts of things that will be going on as the battle changes, and I think it's a really cool mechanic to have in that theme. On the table, I think it's really well implemented, because it's the sort of thing that if you're really good at your resource management and you don't burn all your CPs just for the sake of it, this is something that will separate the sort of lower end skill players or newer players from the really high tier players, and it's one of those things that the more you play it, the better you will get with it. So if you are classing yourself as one of those lower skill players, maybe you're not so good with it, you will get better over time, and I think it's great when you have a book like that you can literally feel yourself getting better with it the more you play with it. But the fact that this army in the lore is very much like that, they set themselves up really strong, and they're looking for that sort of tactical mindset to break the enemy's back on the battlefield, and that's exactly how it plays into this book. So for the second point, the book's theme is exactly on point in my opinion. My third point for this book on its first impressions is whether you're playing for a competitive element or you're just playing sort of casually for fun, whether you're doing something narratively, there's a little bit of something for everyone in this book, and it will lend itself into playing multiple ways. If you want to flood the board with hordes of exploding Mortek Guard, you can. If you want to play an entire mounted undead army, you can do that. If you want to play a very small like elite style list with just the bigger guys like your Immortus Guard or your Necropolis Stalkers, you can do that as well. So there's, even though a big complaint about the Ossiarch range is the fact it has a lack of war scrolls or lack of unit choice within itself, the units that this book does offer opens up into lots of avenues through the subfactions, through unlocking battle line by taking certain leaders. There are lots of different ways to be able to play with the smaller range that you have, and I think that that's great because it offers and opens up a lot of doors to different players who want to play in different ways. And to me, in my opinion, that can never be a bad thing, and the fact that there is such a sort of low war scroll count in this book, if you compare it to something like Stormcast, who have probably just as many heroes, if not more, than this entire book has war scrolls itself. I know some books have more, some have less. Ossiarch certainly aren't the worst off. If you look at something like Ironjaws, they have even less inside the Ironjaws themselves, if you don't go into like Big War or something, but that's a discussion for another day. We're just going to talk about the OBR here. But yeah, so there is something for everyone, whether you want to play it in the most efficient competitive way, there are going to be ways to do that, but if you just want to take something fluffy, like you just want a whole host of Death Riders, just nothing but guys on horses, you can absolutely do that, and I think it's always great when a tome opens up those avenues of different playstyles. My last impression, first impression from this book before we get into the sort of positive changes and the negative changes, was that this book comes across very rock paper scissors heavy, and it's not always in the best of ways. What I mean by that is you want in the game for there to be this rock paper scissors element, so you want your hammer unit, your big aggressive unit that's made to go out and just destroy things, you want that to play that role, and there are certain things such as chaff which are just there to act as speed bumps. They're there to be killed by those hammers, but they're cheap, you don't really care about them, so you throw them in front of the hammer to distract them so they don't get into your good units, so on and so forth. You've got more defensive units that you want to use to block off and make choke points, that kind of thing. So you've got X unit will beat Y unit in Z situation, for example, but in general this whole book can feel very rock paper scissor very rock paper scissor heavy, just in the matchup in general. So for example, you've got Null Myriad, which is a sub-faction which is really anti-magic. You've got guys called Mortisans, and basically if your Mortisan heroes are within a certain bubble next to your units, they just ignore spells on a 2+. Now, into someone whose entire strategy relies on magic, if you're playing Null Myriad, they are just going to have a bad time straight up, and it's just not going to be good. There's also certain counters to the OBR in the reverse, where certain things like really strong shooting armies are going to absolutely tear your OBR apart. There are ways to counter it, and we will get into that later on down the line in more in-depth tactics. But there are just certain matchups where this army is either going to absolutely destroy your opponent in a handful of turns, or you're going to be on the receiving end of that in a handful of turns if it's, you know, not going your way, which isn't always the best thing to have. Like I said, you almost want the mini rock paper scissors to be happening in the game, unit per unit, but this army feels like one of those ones where it's just generally you're going to rock up to the table, you're going to see what your opponent's pulling out, and it's either it can go really, really well, or it can go really, really badly, which obviously you don't want in a very common theme. If that happened on a broader spectrum of the game, where you just have certain armies beating other armies outright, then it's not very good for player matchups. So those are just a few points that I wanted to put out there, my first impressions, things that I thought of the book. Overall, I think the book's in a very, very good place. Points adjustments, it needs a few tweaks here and there, but that's just like my first impression of it. It's a very open book, but it feels like it should do. It feels like an Ossiarch army. And yeah, there's not really much more to say about that. If you love the lore, if you like the old book, then this book will be right up your street and something that you'll want to play. So with that said, let's jump in and see a few more of the specific changes that happened to the book. And I'm going to start off by saying some of the positive ones that I've found from this book compared to the old book. Number one on my list we touched on slightly already earlier, but that is the change from the relentless discipline points to command points and letting the book open up and play in the modern rule set. So like I said earlier, you had RDP, which was kind of your command points before command points actually existed, but that's all now been scrapped. You now just generate command points like everyone else, but you do get access to a lot more of them depending how you build your army. But this now allows you to be able to use the universal command points that you couldn't before, so you can do things like redeploy, you can all out attack, you can all out defense, as well as having your big table of Ossiarch commands, which then makes the army really feel like an OBR army as it should. And again, that's a really positive change because it brings the book into the the modern rule set, as I said before, and it's now able to play the same game as everyone else instead of doing its own little weird thing in the corner. So that's good. My second positive change for this book, and it's a really big one, and this is a guy that I think you're going to see in a lot of lists, and that is Catacross, the Mortarch of the Necropolis himself. Wow, what a positive glow up to his war scroll. That war scroll before was good if you were playing it within his subfaction. A lot of his abilities were subfaction locked to his thing, which is Mortis Praetorians. That's now all been scrapped. He's still Mortis Praetorian keyworded himself, but his abilities don't just affect units from that subfaction anymore. So now you can put Catacross into any of the other subfactions, so like Crematoriums or Petrifex Elite, and he can actually use his aura of buffing units on any other subfaction which he may be included in, and that is absolutely fantastic to be able to use the big leader of the book, Nagash aside, the actual specific OBR leader of the book in all of the OBR armies, just like how it should be. And also his war scroll himself, the cleanup on that was just fantastic, having all those different attack profiles just merged, not having to keep track of all the little guys on his base, like as he takes wounds, which ones have died off, which abilities you still have. So just overall, plus, thumbs up, can't say enough good things about the changes to Catacross's scroll. He's also very strong on top of that, so I think you're going to be seeing him a lot more because it's a lot easier for someone to play with that model. It's a lot easier to be able to explain to your opponent what that model does at all times, and just he's generally very good for OBR, so that's a really good change in my opinion. The third positive change, and the last one that I've got here for my little list, is the healing mechanic stayed, and it's still very strong, and or in my opinion got a little bit stronger. Now, I've always been in the belief that death armies should have sort of mediocre troops, more of them, so they're not very good, but there's more of them, and you're doing that whole grinding, attrition, wearing the enemy down. You know, every time they take a loss, they're going to feel it. You might lose a handful of guys, but you're then able to heal them back up. Now, that is more so in something like a SOULBLIGHT army. You know, if you're chucking out like 120 zombies, you expect that to be the case. Like, zombies just should be shambling, rubbish zombies. But there should be like hordes and hordes of them, and it should just feel relentless, and like a fighting against that struggle. Now, OBR are in that weird space of that they are the elite death army, so they can't be too rubbish, but at the same time you still want that feeling of recursion, because in my opinion that's how every good death army should be, and this book didn't lose it. I was a bit worried. I've been playing NIGHTHAUNT for a long time, and as much improved the new 3rd edition NIGHTHAUNT tome is over the other one, there was definitely a lot more healing factors in the old NIGHTHAUNT book. Now they have their own positive, negative ways of weighing up, you know, how strong they are versus how much you can heal back, because it's a very hard mechanic to balance. If you have too much healing, then you can really drown out your opponents, and it's just not fair, because in essence, as your stuff dies and comes back, you're playing with that many points more than your opponent is, because you've brought back 1,000 points worth of stuff in a 2,000 point game, so you've essentially had a 3,000 point army over the course of that. So when your scroll initially comes out, your units and your heroes are going to be that much more expensive, because you have to factor in the ability that they're going to be bringing other guys back onto the table, so you have to pay a little bit more for them and then use them throughout the game to make it feel better. But I was worried when this book came out that Games Workshop were going to nerf the healing a little bit, you know, just make things stronger but then not come back as often, because again, that's just the easier way to balance things. But seeing that the Bone Shaper, you know, kept his ability just flat 3 heals, all of the big guys, Arcan, Catacross, they can heal, and multiple units in a big sort of AoE. The fact that there's still the artifact to do the double heal, and that got a little bit better as well. And the biggest positive change to the healing, of course, is being able to bring back your Stalkers and your Immortus Guard, so you can bring back your bigger guys, which was great. Because in the old book, that really hurt. Like, every one of those that you lost, you could bring back more tech for days between the Harvester and your heroes, but every time you lost a Stalker or a Guard, you were like, oh man, like that hurt. So I'm so happy, and I think it's great. Everyone at the moment that I spoke to says that the book feels a little bit heavy on points, but then again, like I said, you have to factor in how much those healing mechanics across the army, which are really strong in this book, can counter that out. So your troops, although being a bit more expensive, again, OBR is more of an elite army. We're not playing with like little zombies here. You know, we've got very elite troops that are very good, combined with their netherite weapons, combined with all the commands that they have access to, generally decent armor across the board, lots of ways to buff that through heroes. Like, it's going to be a bit more expensive, and then we've got that great healing mechanic on top. So that's just part of the challenge of playing the army, in my opinion. So those are a few of the positive changes that I've pointed out. I won't go through all of them, because if I was to point out every single thing I saw in the book straight away, I think we'd be here for a very long time, and I'm watching the timer go up now as I am rambling on, and yeah, let's just keep moving. So those are the positive things, the main things that jumped out at me, and now we're going to talk about some of the more negative things that jumped out at me on my initial read-through of the book. And number one is the Mortek Crawler. I found him to be a little underwhelming. I really wanted this unit to be a lot stronger than it is. I understand that its role has changed. It's no longer a straight up damaging war scroll. You know, before you had that lack of rend, but you did have damage 5, so when you got those hits through, it felt really effective. You know, if you're firing into a 10-man unit, you get 2 wounds off, they fail a couple of saves, you killing that whole 10-man unit. Like, it felt good when it happened. Again, as save stacking came through and different metas come and go, the Crawler had its time in the sun, and then it also went away. When things are on like a 2-up re-rollable save, then the Crawler was just rubbish, because it just never kill anything. So I was hoping that the Crawler would find its balance. I wanted it to be a bit more effective. Obviously, you don't want it to be too strong. I'm not looking for it to be like Ren 3 damage 5 with like 6 shots or anything crazy like that. And I understand that its new scroll is more of a utility piece. You're taking it to fire at units. You want to be able to get that 3+ for focus firing on them and making them strike last. The damage is kind of like an afterthought. If you get any chip damage through, then that's great, but really you're just using it for that fight last mechanic. But again, just in my personal opinion, I was hoping for it to be a bit more punchy in that sort of middle ground, and for me it just fell short of the mark, so I can't really see myself using it too much at the moment. Again, as we go through more reps, get more experience with this book, that may change. I might find that being able to make the enemy fight last for specific fights is something that we're going to be looking for. You know, we're probably not too far away from going to be, you know, about a year out, I reckon, from like a 4th edition. We've got 40k coming up on the horizon, so Sigmar will be kind of behind that. So who knows, when we get into something like that really far down the line, then crawlers might be what we need. My second negative change, and it's not really a negative change because it was kind of pants in the old book and it still kind of is pants now, and that is that Nagash is still a bit meh inside this army. Like, he can work, you can make it work if you really want to, but at the same time it just, I don't know what it is, every time they do the Nagash scroll, he just feels very clunky and just hard to put into this army. And again, I think it's mainly because he does so much. Like, he's such a strong spellcaster. Then you have the problem of death armies having that healing / resurrection mechanic, and I do love the new healing that they've given to Nagash, you know, being able to bring back units at half strength, all that good stuff. I think, you know, he's fun. In big games like 3,000-4,000 points, I think you just take your normal list, you chuck Nagash on top because he is just like 1,000 points. Then he'd probably feel much better, but to be honest, I've never played a game of Sigmar that high, and in the 2,000 point list he just feels too clunky compared to other things like, you know, you see Morathi or Teclis, and it's just a shame, to be honest, to not see Nagash getting that fix, being able to lead his armies in that way. So yeah, I think it's a negative change, even though it didn't really change, but it was just a negative to see that Nagash is still not really a viable option. Again, you can do anything you want. Like, if you're not playing competitively, then it doesn't really matter. Like, you know, it's not that you can't make Nagash work, it's just you really have to, you know, be funneled into a certain space to be able to play Nagash within this tome. And to me it just feels a bit kind of like, yeah, that's not really what I wanted to do. Like, I want to use Nagash, but I don't want to have to just be shoehorned into this particular style. So that was that. So yeah. Number 3, and my last negative change, was that some of the subfactions still feel a little bit flat. Now, one of the sins of the older book is you just had 2 things to go. Petrifex Elite was the big nasty in the old book that everyone was scared of at one point, and then it just kind of fell out when the whole book changed and wasn't really in the competitive limelight anymore, but it was still like your go-to. You would occasionally see people with Mortis Praetorians and Catacross, if they could be bothered to deal with that old scroll. But like, Petrifex Elite was the standout, head and shoulders above all the others. You could do things with the other ones for sure, but like, just in general it was just very much fixed on that one subfaction. And as much as I've put this in the negative changes, I do want to say that there's a lot more choice in the subfactions now. I'd say there's 3-4 of them that you can consider, but the main 2 are the Ossiarch Lords and Null Myriad are very specific. So Ossiarch Lords is for it's run and charge on mounted units only, which is cool. But then if, you know, we've got 2 mounted heroes, if you count the Soul Mason on his little chair. Then there's the Liege Cavalos, and then there's the Death Riders, and it's like, that's it. If that's what your whole army wants to be, and you want to play in Ossiarch Lords, then that's great. But to be honest, you're better off just taking those units, if that's what you wanted to take, and putting them in something else, like Mortis Praetorians, so you can countercharge people, or putting them in Crematorians, so you can then explode on death. It's just much better than the Ossiarch Lords one, so it just feels a bit rubbish, to be honest. If there was lots of different cavalry, units to take in this book that perform different roles, then that might be different, but we don't have that, so there it is. And Null Myriad, as we spoke about earlier, can be in that very rock, paper, scissors heavy kind of element negative experience of, yes, it's super strong anti-magic, and to be honest, if you play in a magic heavy meta, like your local club, you've got lots of people that are stomping around with big magic armies, then by sure, play it, ignore all their stuff on a 2+ and watch them cry as you just shut down their entire game plan and stomp all over them. But then at the same time, if you take Null Myriad, say you go to a tournament, you might play against Tzeentch or Lumineth, and it works really well for you. Then the next game you might play against Khorne, and then you've got a subfaction that's doing absolutely nothing for you, where I think that really with the subfactions they should be aiming to give them abilities that sort of just are always doing something, whether it's a little something, like it's themed, obviously Null Myriad is supposed to be anti-magic, but it should just be something like, you know, a bit like you had Zytrek in Lumineth, where it just gave all your wizards like +1 to cast. So maybe Null Myriad should be like enemy wizards within X amount of inches of any Null Myriad unit is at minus such to cast, and if they're in front of like a Null Myriad hero, it's like -2 to cast. Something like that might have been a bit better, or just maybe it's just +1 cast, -1 cast. You know, +1 for you, -1 for enemies if they're within like 12 inches of your units, for example. Then that way, even if you did play against Khorne who aren't slinging spells at you, then you're still at +1, so you're getting something from it. So yeah, a little bit negative that some of the sub-factions are a little bit hit and miss. It would have been nice to see them all opened up, but as much as I've put this in the negative one, it is also kind of a positive, because compared to the old book in an outright sub-faction face-off, there are more choices in my opinion. I'm sure as metas shift and people get the hang of this book, it probably will factor in that, you know, there's 1 or 2 of them that are a lot better than the others. But to be honest, I think the way that you can play, and that the fact that all the war scrolls in this book, bar the poor Soul Reaper, bless him, he doesn't really do anything, is so open that, you know, you can really make any of these sub-factions work if you've really wanted to focus in on them, which at the end of the day I suppose is the point. You pick your sub-faction, you see how that affects your army, and then, you know, that's your platform to build from. So those are a few of my positive and a few of my negative changes and first impressions from this book. So let's do a overall summary. How strong do I think that this book will be in a competitive meta? To be honest, right now in the Gleason Champions side of thing, I think this book is okay. You do have access to a lot of foot heroes that aren't mounted, you know, ones that you want to be taking anyway as they are, so like your Bone Shapers, the new guy, the Ossificer, can't remember how it's pronounced, I haven't got it written in front of me. Those guys, you know, they're kind of things that you want to be running anyway, so it's nice that you're not taking Gleason Champions for the sake of taking them. They're already probably in your list, bar a few of the bigger guys. I think it still sucks that the Soul Mason is counted as being on a mount because of his throne, so he doesn't actually count, but it just is what it is. But that meta's nearly over now anyway. We're going to be getting the new General's Handbook soon, as this one was only a 6-month one. So, you know, for meta specific, I think the book is okay at the moment, because it's full of things that you're going to be want to taking anyway. The War Scrolls and everything in this book are very strong, as we'll be getting into as we do more deeper dives as we go through. But I would probably say that this is a low A tier or a high B tier army. Again, that swings on the matchup dependency, because this army is very rock, paper, scissors. It just lends itself to that way. Again, if you're taking something like Null Myriad and you run up to Tzeentch army, you're going to feel like an S+ tier army. But then if you run that into Khorne, you're probably going to feel like a C tier army kind of thing, because Khorne will just, you know, run straight through it. But the fact that this book has those kind of matchups, but then it also is able to adapt so willingly on the table because of your command points, depending on your player skill and how well you can manage that sort of CP reserve, that this book can play for players who understand it and have a good understanding of the game. If you're taking something like Mortis Praetorians and you really get that counter charge sort of mechanic down, There are things that you can pull off in this book that are just sort of mind-blowing plays that a lot of people probably won't see coming if they don't understand this book inside and out. And again, that balances it up to that higher side of the table. So it is very 50-50, this book. I think, you know, it's one of those where it's going to win. It's going to win probably a little bit more than it loses, but it isn't anything game breaking. You know, it isn't going to be anything that just shatters the meta and it's going to be all OBR all the time, in my opinion. But we will see how that comes as the metas shift and we get the new General's Handbook. It might play into this book very strongly, or it might play completely out of it. You know, if we won't go back to it because we already had one, but if it was like monsters again, then we know that this book doesn't really have that much access to that kind of play. But yeah, so that is my first thoughts and impressions of the new OBR book in a general broad spectrum of talking about it. Sorry that this one's gone on very long, I did not mean it to, but I am just absolutely obsessed with this army at the moment. I love the lore, I love the models, and then with this new book and the way it's going to be playing, I just am absolutely all OBR all the time at the moment. So it's just, yeah, very easy for me to keep talking about these guys and just rambling on. But I hope that I've made some sort of sense here today, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts and feedback on this book. What were your first impressions? What do you like? What do you not like about this book? Comment them down below. I also have links in the description to the OBR Facebook page that I run over on Facebook, and I also have, we launched through the Facebook page, a Discord server that is purely all about OBR. So if OBR is your bread and butter, is your jam on your toast, then I would recommend joining that, because it's just a awesome place filled with awesome people, all talking all OBR all the time. So if you're as obsessed with OBR as I am, links are down in the description below. But thank you very much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I look forward to hearing from you. As always, stay safe and happy wargaming. Psst. Hey you! Did you know that Lakey Wargames now has an official eBay store? You can buy yourself all kinds of pre-painted and new on sprue hobby goodness and support the channel at the same time. There's a link in the description below if you want to check it out. I'd greatly appreciate it, and it's a fantastic way to support the channel. Okay, see you in the next one.